2 minutes.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Excellent. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 4 o'clock. We're going to begin in a few seconds, so I'd like to ask you to please take your seats. So with everybody seated where they wish to be, I think we are ready to make a start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Those who are joining us here in person and those who are joining us online, welcome to our afternoon session. This is TS2-1, the session focusing on strengthening legal and regulatory frameworks to effectively manage existing and emerging risks. My name is Malini Mehra. I am CEO of Globe Legislators and delighted to be the moderator for this afternoon session. I'm joined by 5 extremely distinguished speakers, and they are in no particular order, but I'm standing here so I can look at them all over here. To my immediate right here, we have Dr. Amelia Sharman, who is a Director for Sustainability Reporting, External Reporting Board, New Zealand. She will be followed by Dr. Rosa Galvez, who is a senator from Canada, but also a good friend of us parliamentarians, President of Parlaméricas. We then have, seated next to her, we have Dr. Krishna Vatsa, who is a member of the National Disaster Management Authority of India. And we have Ms. Isabel Joy Oching, who is the Assistant Director, Financial and Sectoral Affairs Department, the Director of Budget, Fiscal and Economic Affairs at the National Treasury of Kenya. I would invite you, if you haven't done so already, to kindly look at their biographies, which should be provided online. So, I will begin with a few scene-setting remarks, and they are really to start with how interesting it is that we have evolved in 2025 to having a GAR that focused very much on some of the themes that we're going to be speaking about. This year's GAR 2025 really emphasized the importance of disaster risk reduction, investment and innovation for financing options to break the cycle of disasters and debt. Today afternoon's conversation really also marks the latest in almost a decade of evolution of the bridging of 2 distinct communities, the communities of disaster risk reduction specialists and the community of financial risk specialists, those who are focused principally on risks presented to international financial markets and systems. So this is, hopefully, it's going to be a paradigm-setting, resetting conversation. For the opening remarks, helping to set the context, I'd like to focus your attention to the excellent concept paper which was produced for today's session. It's a 10-page paper, which you'll be glad to know I'm not going to read out even an excerpted form, but I am going to highlight some of the key points that that paper made. The first is the obvious point that we are here to discuss strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk because it is priority 2 of the 4 priorities set out in the Sendai Framework. We also know, however, that as states reported in the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, that continued siloed disaster risk reduction agencies and policies continue to limit integrated, risk-informed decision-making before risk manifests itself as a shock or a disaster. Subsequently, we know that the MTR underscored the need for a paradigm shift in disaster risk reduction that addressed both the multidimensional, multitemporal, and interconnected nature of existing and emerging risks, because this is critical to building effective risk governance mechanisms that can address risks prior, during, and after disaster, when residual risk manifests as a shock. And they can steer public and private finance, importantly, towards integrated risk-informed investing. So this is the course correction that we are calling for. Essentially, this is the trajectory of travel over the next 5 years. However, with regard to the private sector behavior, we're going to focus a lot on financial markets and private sector at this session today. States also reported in the MTR that without policy and regulatory changes requiring the private sector to incorporate disaster risk reduction in decision-making, little progress will be expected. So this is why I'm particularly glad that some of our speakers are going to focus particularly on that point. We also know that many aspects of the financial system, macroeconomic policy, and public and private financing contribute to creating disaster risks. Instead of enhancing the resilience of societies, current investments often exacerbate risks, increasing the exposure and vulnerability of communities, supply chains, and ecosystems. So that, in short, is the problem statement. What's the point that we are looking to get to at the close of our 90-minute discussion? Well, we hope that this thematic session is going to provide a path forward by identifying and recommending key frameworks, innovations, and practices to enable shared accountability and improve DRR governance through legal and regulatory frameworks. Before we invite our keynote speaker to deliver her address, I would just like to remind you, I don't think you need a reminder because this is day 2 and you're familiar with Slido, but we will be relying on the Slido tool to gather some questions, and we will have a Q&A session after we've had a round of around 5 questions or so with the panelists. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Amelia Sharman to please deliver the keynote address. Amelia.
Thank you, Malini. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a particular honour to be here today as somewhat of an outsider to your disaster risk and reduction community, but I hope that by informing you of something that is going on inside my standard-setting community, that we can advance forward together. I've heard so much already this week about integrating climate and disaster risk and reduction, and so today I'm here to speak to you about something called climate-related disclosures and the lessons that we have learned as a national standard setter in addressing systems risk that are hopefully of very practical relevance to you in the DIR community. So, who am I? What is the standard setter and what do we do? I am Director Sustainability Reporting at the External Reporting Board of New Zealand, or XRB for short. And we set reporting standards for financial reporting, audit and assurance, and also sustainability. We are an independent part of the New Zealand government, and we are a very small but important player in the large, complex financial ecosystem. I would like to tell you a story today, a story about the implementation of a new piece of climate policy in New Zealand. In 2021, the New Zealand government decided to implement mandatory disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities by the way of reporting standards. In many countries, in New Zealand as well, these are pieces of secondary legislation. To enact secondary legislation, we need primary legislation. So, Parliament amended our Financial Reporting Act, making climate-related disclosures applicable to our largest entities. These are our banks, our insurers, our largest listed debt and equity issuers. Parliament decides who should report. We at the XRB decide what they should report. So, we went about setting the reporting standards for climate-related disclosures. What are climate-related disclosures? This is a series of work that an entity must do, working through aspects of their risks and opportunities from climate change, their current and anticipated impacts and financial impacts from climate change, and how to transition their strategy and business model based on what they have learnt by going through that process, including climate-related scenario analysis. We also set the standards for the assurance of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a particularly gnarly piece of work, I must say. How did we come up with these standards? We set the standards based on the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was an initiative of the Financial Stability Board. Both the Sendai Framework and the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, are based on addressing systemic risk. They are at their heart interconnected. But climate-related disclosures, it was a new and rapidly evolving space where we had to establish internationally aligned yet locally relevant disclosure requirements that met the needs of our entities in terms of benefit to their own decision making, but also of key stakeholders such as their investors. It is external reporting after all. How did we go about doing this? Firstly, we set in place a principles-based disclosure regime supported by guidance. Who were we to know what the best disclosure requirements were and set very prescriptive rules? This was a new and rapidly evolving space. We're 2 years now into mandatory disclosure and we have learnt a lot and we are updating our guidance as we've gone on. We also supported it by encouraging sector-level scenario analysis. Every entity had to put their own business model and strategy into the wind tunnel and work out whether it was resilient to unpredictable climate futures. And doing that, you needed to draw from international climate scenarios. It's very hard to bridge that gap, so we got about 15 of our sectors together in New Zealand to do that work together. And we also learnt along the way that some of this was really, really difficult. And so we provided amendments last year to give extra time to particularly difficult areas. Now, why have I told you all of this stuff about climate-related disclosures? One of the things, I want to tell you some of the lessons that we learnt along the way. Firstly, there's this idea in the climate community about really strong connection to a net zero future. We call this carbon tunnel vision. However, it was so important that adaptation and resilience are built into the heart of a climate-related disclosure regime because this gives value to the entity. It provides that deep sense of self-interest to them as to why this was important, why it was a strategy exercise and not just a piece of reporting compliance. We made analogies with other types of risk like health and safety risk, but we also needed to enhance an understanding of uncertainty and systemic risk. As I said before, Sendai and the TCFD are both based on an understanding of systemic risk, so there is a significant amount of crossover. We also worked with trusted advisors, our Institute of Directors, our Sustainable Business Council, to ensure that the messaging that we had was practical to the audiences we were delivering it to. It is still very early days, but information is power and it enables decision makers to make better decisions. These are investors, these are the people inside the companies. And my message to other standard setters is always to really, if you're implementing climate-related disclosures, emphasise that strategic benefit rather than compliance. So I've told you all the lessons that I learned as a standard setter in this approach. What is the lesson for you in the DRR community? Countries all around the world are implementing mandatory climate-related disclosures. This is a major opportunity for you to connect in with the standard setting and reporting community and share what you know about disaster risk, about resilience, about preparedness and recovery. We are both committed in our two communities to better information availability for better decision making on systemic risk. Together, we can really enhance that resilient future, and I encourage you to work with your jurisdictional, your national standard setter, find out who they are, talk to them about mandatory climate-related disclosures, mandatory nature-related disclosures, mandatory systems-related disclosures, to think about how they can understand better resilience to put it into their model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amelia, and you've also given us a little bit of headroom. You're very succinct in your presentation and laid out, as you clearly put it, the opportunity agenda that there is between linking these two professional communities, one which focuses on financial regulation with its body of supervisory and scrutiny agencies, regulatory authorities, and standard setters. So we'll come back to that. Hopefully we'll be picking up and coming out with some very concrete suggestions towards the end of the session. For now, however, I'd like to pose question one to some of our panelists. And this question is, how can legislation and financial regulatory mechanisms enable risk-informed investment in the medium to long term? Importantly, what has worked? And I would like to invite Dr. Rosa Galvez to be the first respondent to this question, please.
Now, yes, thank you. Okay, so I think by now you all know that without the intervention, the catalytic intervention of the finance sector, and I mean in the private and public banks, insurance, pension plans, we won't be able to reduce risk and prevent disasters. While I was living in Peru, I worry a lot about earthquakes and tsunamis, but since I live in Canada, I really worry a lot about forest fires, floodings, and the role of the insurance that are leaving some of our places because of recurrent extreme weather events and very destructive. So well-designed legislations can provide with the clarity, with the incentive, with the accountability that is needed, but mostly they can also provide with the predictability and the stability that the financial sector is looking for in order to invest to reduce this risk. So there are several approaches that we can use in legislation. One is, as Amelia said, about transparency and accountability. So 2 years ago, I tabled the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which tries to guide the finance sector in Canada to solve this issue of double materiality, because at the same time that the financial sector is really worried, and it's increasingly worried and increasingly in risk because of the destruction of basic infrastructure, at the same time they are investing still in things that produce and increase the risk. So in this climate aligned finance legislation, we want to like Amelia said, we want to have transparency and disclose, mandatory disclosure of the risk. And not only the climate-related risk, but also the nature-related risk and the biodiversity-related risk, because we are always working in silos and we need to make it more holistic approach. So these legislations are there as an approach based on best practices seen around the world. And it is not only to, once an extreme weather event destroys something, but also to prevent, because we need to reduce the risk. I think that ends my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much. And as you all know, we have the discipline of the monitor in the front, which tells you exactly when you need to come to a stop. So thank you so much, Rosa. And we're now going to turn to Isabel Joy Ochieng, please. Your perspective from the Finance Ministry, the Department, the National Treasury of Kenya, please.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of how legislation and financial regulatory mechanisms can enable risk-informed investments, they help to play a significant role in reducing risks that may emanate from aspects relating to various hazards that we face as a country. And therefore, regulatory frameworks have to have deliberate provisions that support risk-informed investments and also help to include the role of different players. Regulatory frameworks, they also help to provide an enabling environment that seek to promote shared accountability, risk-informed decision-making, as well as proactive investments across sectors. They also help to prevent, reduce, and manage disaster risks. So in terms of Kenya's experience and what has worked, Kenya's journey has been a gradual one, and one that continues to represent great progress over time. It starts from what is provided for in the Constitution of Kenya that provides the role of disaster risk management as being a shared function between both the national and subnational government levels. We also have the process of where we are developing the disaster risk management bill that is currently in Parliament that seeks to provide for a coordinating framework for disaster risk management at both levels of government. We also have aspects relating to the Kenya Vision 2030, which is the blueprint of the country implemented within 5-year medium-term plans that also incorporates aspects of disaster risk reduction in various sectors. In terms of budgeting and investments, this has been a game changer in our country over the last few years, where we find that in the budget circular, currently there are considerations for aspects relating to climate change adaptation as a key consideration when prioritizing projects to be funded. We also have aspects relating to public investment management. We do have a public investment management regulations, which have been developed pursuant to the provisions of the overarching law on Public Finance Management Act that incorporate aspects of climate risks to be included when making considerations for public investments. We also have aspects relating to public-private partnerships, where there's the Kenya Public-Private Partnerships Act that has considerations currently mainly on handling financial and projects risks, but there is ongoing work on how to also include aspects relating to climate-related risks in public-private partnerships. So those are some of the examples that are working and continue to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel Joy. I'm now going to ask the same question to Dr. Krishna Vatsa, but just to emphasize, because of course from an Indian perspective, there's quite a long history of regulatory and legislative frameworks addressing this issue of how to enable more risk-informed legislation. Again, the question is about what's worked over the mid to the long term. So your reflections on that, please.
So, thank you. Risk reduction, risk management is a process that is initiated through a legislation and reinforced through financial provisions. And it leads to several other consequences which improve the regulations and improve the risk management standards. So just to give you the illustration from India, we have Disaster Management Act 2005, and it laid the provision for risk reduction, risk management through mitigation. It provided for mitigation fund, and now that the government of India has set up a mitigation fund, it has given a big fillip to investment in risk reduction across the regions, across the hazards. So we have just started, say, a large-scale national program in landslide risk mitigation. Now, when you start working on the landslide risk, you need to assess the risks, and the most important thing here is to take up those mitigation measures that ensure the stability of slopes, the mountain slopes. So we are concerned with taking all those preventive measures that ensure the slope stability. Now, the slope stability cannot just be ensured through the mitigation measures. It requires some regulations, local regulations, how the cities, how the towns, how the districts are allowing the development on the slopes. So in the next 2 years or 3 years, I anticipate a number of regulations coming up to ensure the slope stability as part of the risk management. And I can say the same thing about other risks where we are investing. Say, we are also investing in the Glacier Lake outburst floods. Now, once we start investing in this, we will also look at the feasibility of the hydel projects downstream, all the glacial lakes, the rivers that are coming forth. So it would lead to certain regulations, certain risk management mechanisms that improve the risk protection, the protection of all these projects and assets. But what is most important is that there is a process at work, there is a context here, and you need to connect the dots, that you have a legislation, you have the financial provision, you have a program, and then the program leads to regulations. This is how the risk management flows, and this is how we need to pursue it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. And key takeaway for me there is that this process is increasingly becoming decentralized and localized, which is one of the focuses of the Sendai Framework. So you're talking about the need to make sure that we have local planning rules.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It's very, very important that all these risk management mechanisms, they cannot be centrally prescribed because they vary from one area to another. And it's important that we take those decisions at the local level, which means that the local authorities be given more power. So most important development is that through this recent legislative amendment, we have set up disaster management authorities at the city level, urban disaster management authorities. Once we do that, then there will be a huge amount of regulations which prevent the occurrences of disasters in the urban centers, which have become major concentrations of risk. So we can see that these kind of institutional innovations lead to far-reaching consequences in terms of risk management.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Michael Obersteiner, who is a director of Environmental Change Institutes. And again, you are one of the interlopers into the DRR discussion because you're coming from a different professional background. So from where you sit, really looking at financial risk management, how is this conversation shaping up for you?
Yeah. Well, I also have a forestry background, and slope stability is very dear to my heart as a mountain risk hazard manager. But if we take that example and first talk about what works and what doesn't work. And what doesn't work is how the current financial rules operate. So you all have seen the video of the Swiss town that kind of got destroyed by huge landslide. If you were to invest in a hotel in that particular village 10 years ago, the bank would look at you and would assess the stability of the slopes according to historical records, because the rules of the financial sector are only backward-looking and not forward-looking. And so here we are basically, the financial rules are such that we are creating systemic risk. And in this case, it was a true systemic risk because the risk was not seen. However, if we had done proper analysis, one could have predicted what happened. And so now let me very shortly talk to what works. And there is now the largest institutional investor, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. They got mandated to do an analysis that is forward-looking. So they looked into their investment portfolios and did the traditional analysis, and they found out that the risk score was something like 2 to 4% risk of losing some of their money. However, when they did the forward-looking analysis, they found it's 19 to 27%. So it's an order of magnitude difference in the risk assessment, and they immediately acted. So they went out of many of the fossil fuel companies, but they also reassessed their investments into data centers, for example, because some of the data centers are not water secure, for example. So here, they also became more active shareholders in some of the existing investments. So here, just shifting the paradigm from backward-looking risk assessment to forward-looking risk assessment has huge implications on, and this is $1.6 trillion worth of investment. So here, just simply the way how we do risk assessment, biophysical and financial, really moves the needle of where money will go in the future.
Thank you very much, both for sharing what hasn't worked and what does work, and what hopefully will work more effectively in the future. Amelia, I'm going to come back to you, please, to help us close off this section, this first round of discussion. Really struck by what you were saying about the being mandated. So what you're doing was mandated by Parliament to tell you that you must do it, but the what is entirely up to you. So just picking up on the key point that was made by Michael, which is really looking at what data you're looking at, you know, so forward-looking, past. So value your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you about financial reporting. I mean, financial reporting is really mature. It's very well understood. Are there any accountants in the room? No? Well,
That's extraordinary.
one at the back. Oh, good on you. I'm also not an accountant. But, you know, it has a very different purpose and lens and boundaries to climate disclosure, because information on financial performance and position is really about looking at a point in time, which is based on known past events, and it's really different to climate reporting. Climate reporting is designed to help entities and information users to better understand the future, to better understand those longer-term impacts on their decision-making, taking that real risk and opportunity lens. That's a fundamental part of it. But, you know, without a mandatory regime, will behaviour change? You need to ask that question. So how do we know that something like this is actually going to make a difference? So I'm a researcher. I really wanted to answer that question. So we have commissioned a multi-year effectiveness evaluation of the climate-related disclosure regime in New Zealand. So that's being led by one of our leading universities, the University of Otago, alongside the University of Zurich. And they're doing a really exciting study. It's a mixed method study from discourse analysis to large language model analysis, taking an ex-ante and ex-post assessment of, is it making a difference to the decision-making by entities and the users of that information. And excitingly, the early results were just published a couple of weeks ago, and they are finding that mandatory reporting is reducing the carbon intensity of funds, and that the quality of reporting for corporate issuers is increasing. And, you know, we're really looking forward to tracking the impact of that reporting over time, but I would 100% argue that if you want to know what works, you've got to put the effort in to the evaluation and to the tracking of whether it works. We're really good, I think, sometimes in the policy community about making new policies, because that's really exciting, and not putting in the effort and the budget for evaluation over time.
Very encouraging note to end this session on, but I would like to share some of the answers that we've had from the audience to this question on what works. So here to share just a few. Firstly, coherent risk-informed development and DRR mainstreaming across development, sectoral, planning and investments works. This also includes tapping into funding available with line ministries such as Women and Social Welfare Ministries, Public Works, Environment, Health, Education, Infrastructure, etc. So really a kind of, I note that Finance Ministry's defence is not noted, but it is a stretch. It's a whole of government approach. And finally, that transparency and trust are essential, provide legal stability for investing and making decisions, really borne out by the examples that you've provided, Amelia, you know, bearing in mind that the TCFD emerged out of the global financial crisis of 2008, when we had an entire review of the weaknesses in the international financial system, establishment of new supervisory bodies, regulatory authorities, and standards. So some great lessons to take away from that session. We will move quickly on to our next one without pausing for breath. It's very still out there, but a very, very full room. We now move to question 2, which is on how can legal and regulatory frameworks be used to ensure those most responsible for risk creation contribute their fair share to risk prevention and reduction. So we're using a lot of the same words, but I want you to focus on the issue here, which is around accountability. Who is most responsible for risk creation? How can they contribute their fair share to risk prevention and reduction? So, to kick us off, I'm going to ask Dr. Galvez to provide her reflections.
Okay, thank you. So I will touch three subjects. But first, just to say for the context that Canada is warming 2-3 times faster than the rest of the planet, and our Arctic is warming 5 to 7 times faster than the rest of the planet. So right now, for us in Canada, is the global warming that is increasing the risk of extreme weather events and brings flooding, forest fires, and erosion of coastal areas. So in the legislation, in every province in Canada, at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level, there is this principle and enshrining law that is polluter pays. Yet, I'm to see when and where polluter pays. So this is very difficult. This is very difficult to implement polluter pays. So I will say that even though it is there, enforcing it's very difficult. But we have an environmental impact assessment, and in the modernization of the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, we added that projects needs to consider climate change, needs to consider regional changes. Like, for example, in Quebec, we have a lot of erosion, but in other places, temperature has not changed much, etc. And so regional assessment should indicate how to go better to include this principle. And the last thing is about the energy transition. We know that Canada, if we take a picture, we say, oh, we contribute very little. But this is today. The reality is that historically, as a G7 country, we have contributed a lot, and out of the G7, we are the only country that haven't decoupled growth from greenhouse emissions. And we are a net exporter of oil and gas. And so depending on, because we don't have mandatory risk disclosure, people are talking about only Scope 1 and Scope 2, when in reality we should be talking about 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So the third thing is about the energy transition. And in the energy transition is that while some provinces, like in Quebec, we are reducing emissions and we are using clean energy, there are other provinces that are still very much invested in coal and gas and oil, very heavy oil. And so it is very, it's not equal. And so the coherence between the provincial and the federal legislation is of importance in our case. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you. I should add that Senator Galvez is the senator for Bedford in Quebec, which is why you're referring a lot to Quebec. I also know that there's quite a lot of variation amongst the different provinces, and I do hope that we can have you touch a little on that in a discussion session. But I'd now like to go straight to Dr. Krishna Vatsa. The same question, please, which once again is on the use of regulatory and legal frameworks to ensure those responsible for risk creation contribute their fair share to prevention and reduction.
It's a very contentious issue to establish who is contributing to the risks, how the risks are getting created in the process. Those who are building roads in the floodplains, would they ever admit that they are adding to the flood risks? Those who are constructing highways in the hills, would they ever admit that they are adding to the risks? They would say they have been assigned a task, they are doing it, it has got all the environmental clearances, they are well within their ambit to build the roads and provide the access that is the need of the hour. So if we lead the discussion like that, it would create a huge amount of controversy and we would not reach anywhere. I would say that we need to frame the discussion a little differently, that of course some of these developments need to be guided by adequate regulations. They need to be reinforced, supported through adequate risk assessments, and we need to find certain ways through which we can build roads in the floodplains without adding to the risks. If we lead the discussion that way, perhaps it would have better resonance than we say that, let's punish those who are creating the risks. I mean, I'm just giving another example. Urban heat island impact. This is a serious risk today. We are having huge amount of rains in a very short spell of time, largely due to the industrial activities. Do you think anyone in the city, anyone who are owning those units would ever admit that what they are doing is actually contributing to the urban heat island impact? No, and it's not going to be the case. These are some of the issues that we need to live with and perhaps deal with it a little differently than this mode that you are suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you've raised some very interesting points there that would really be worthy of a discussion. As you say, this is a very contentious issue, whether it's at a micro or national or international level. So we're going to switch gear a little bit. We're going to move to our third question. And this is, what type of government incentives, legislation or regulation have been or would be most effective to promote risk-informed investment by the private sector? So not too far away from the points that you were making, but slightly different. So I would like to, first of all, invite Dr. Amelia Sharman to respond to that question.
Thanks, Malini. I think to answer that question, you've got to go back in time. I mean, for over a quarter of a century now, we have understood that there are waves of policy. So firstly, there's direct environmental regulation, are you emitting lots of stuff out of your smokestacks? Then came the market-based mechanisms, the ET, emissions trading schemes, the carbon taxes, and disclosures are a third wave of environmental policy that's kind of adding on top of it. And we also know that best practice approaches recognise that a mix of regulatory interventions are likely to be necessary to solve complex policy challenges, and that also the mix must be tailored to the market or context in question. I cannot pick up the mix from Canada or India and make it work in New Zealand. You have to really think about the context and what is going to be the responsiveness of your context to the ideas that you're bringing in from somewhere else. So, as I noted previously, we're studying the impact of climate-related disclosures in New Zealand. They are incorporating resilience as a really core aspect, so I'm excited to share that content with you, but I would argue that study cannot be understood in isolation. It's only examining the impact of mandatory climate-related disclosures on the decisions made by reporting entities and the users of those climate statements. It is not commenting on an appropriate policy mix for New Zealand to deal with resilience, climate change, etc. But a key message I have is that without that research, we would only be hearing anecdotes about whether it worked or not. So again, I would really strongly advocate the importance of commissioning research to ask, can I measure the effectiveness of this regulatory approach or not? It's fundamental to have that information to determine whether to keep on with that policy in your context, and also to give information to another context about whether or not it might be suitable for uplift in theirs.
Great, and you've provided me with a perfect segue, since you were talking about the need for additional research, to move to Dr. Michael Obersteiner, because Michael, of course, you are in the 1% of the most often cited scientists, yes, in the Web of Science, so 250 articles. Your thoughts, please, on this question, and in particular, perhaps a response to Amelia's point.
Publishing a lot doesn't mean that we have all of the answers. But if we just stick to this example of the stability of the slopes, if there is good planning regulation that you should not build in places that are prone to landslides, then the banks will not give out the loans. If a regulation, if there's a regulation that mandatory insurance, then the bank would be looking at you very differently. And so everything that is not properly regulated will end up as financial risk. Everything that is not properly managed in terms of risk management will end up with more expensive loans. And you can even elevate this up to a national level. Countries that are consistently hit by natural disasters, they get into a debt spiral. So they get, not only they don't get any loans anymore, if they get it at a much higher rate. However, the economy is going down, so they cannot even serve their debts. There's debt restructuring. So here, nowadays it's very fashionable to deregulate. However, if you deregulate on natural disasters and the type of risks we are talking about, all what we are creating is more financial risks. So you cannot deregulate away reality. That's not possible. It's in your self-interest, depending on the nature of the risk. You know, if it's your local risk of a landslide, or if it's a systemic macroeconomic risk, then there are different responsibilities, what we discussed before, but the risk ends up somewhere. So someone needs to pick up the torch and say, I actually want to do something proactive about this because it's in my enlightened self-interest to do so.
Great. The risk ends up somewhere. Who's responsible for it? So I'm going to now ask Isabel Joy, please. This thorny question of how you promote risk-informed investment by the private sector.
Thank you very much. How I would answer that is basically having a law or a binding document that guides how the private sector engages with the public sector, and then within it embed what aspects they need to follow. Like I mentioned, in Kenya, there is the Public-Private Partnership Act, which spells out how the private sector can collaborate with the public sector in various aspects, including infrastructure, investments, and many others. And within such types of legislations, then they can incorporate aspects relating to climate risks or risk reduction aspects, which then also bind the private sector when they need to operate in countries such as Kenya or any other. Then another aspect is perhaps there's also the aspects on green taxonomy, which are promoted basically by the financial services sector. Like, for example, the banking sector in Kenya, there is the aspect on work relating to green taxonomy, as well as guidance on climate-related risk management, which then indicate how various businesses are able to align their operations to the aspects within the taxonomy. So it's basically having legislative framework that incorporates the private sector within it, and then how then they are able to engage with the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a kind of national version of the TCFD that you're describing? Yeah?
Yes, that is it.
Yeah. So thank you. So now that, actually the answers are coming in. So the answers are coming in to question 2, and I hope I will also have question 3. So let me share with you what our audience online and here in the room thinks some of the answers are to question 2. The question again was, how can legal and regulatory frameworks be used to ensure those most responsible for risk creation contribute their fair share to risk prevention and reduction? So the answer that we had to that was, the question is the answer, which is why I read out the question. Through taxes, liability laws, and compliance standards, frameworks can also enforce accountability via penalties and incentives that shift responsibility towards those driving the risky behaviors. Businesses, economic and political vested interests, there's a need for political will to ensure transparency and welfare of the communities and the households by ensuring that they are not put in perilous situations, so that risk prevention approach again. And finally, another thought, by integrating climate change and disaster risk into decision support tools So not just regulations and frameworks, but practical tools. We also have an example from Ghana, where privately owned critical infrastructure now has to have flood insurance. So some of the answers to question 3 are, first of all, there's a lot of repeat of one word, law. Laws. Regulations governing laws. Integrated territorial planning plans, taxes, access to market, and authorities that dare to impose sanctions for non-compliance with laws, regulations, and regulatory plans. Laws should incentivize learning, improving, and sharing, and clearly steering away from a blame culture of criminal law-based approaches. Very interesting. That's the first time the distinction between civil and criminal has been brought up. It's a huge challenge to force companies to disclose information. They may also have to leave the challenge to the island states. So yeah, the issue of enforcement, who enforces, be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that in terms of enforcement. Compliance is usually seen as a very low-grade thing, but in many contexts, getting compliance requires a high degree of political engagement and intervention. So those are some of the answers to question 3. Let us move to question 4. How can governance frameworks better recognize and respond to the interconnected nature of cascading and compounding risk drivers and impacts? For example, we've had it mentioned before, extreme heat, biodiversity loss, and pollution. With some examples, please. So let us start with Dr. Krishnavatsa, please.
So I would say that interconnected risks also require interconnected solutions that come from different areas of regulations, finance, and norms, and some of the practical implications of investment in certain areas. So, I can just give you an example. We are right now working on revision of the building codes. Now, it is a very, very important issue. It has cost implications on the one side, because if we improve the specifications, it increases the cost, and that cost applies to a large number of investors who are working in the construction sector. At the same time, we also have the issues of safety. So how are we balancing some of these things? I think it's very, very important that we have a discussion on giving the evidence of what the codes are across the countries, what kind of codes are, what are the cost implications, what are the long-term implications of the codes, what are the implications for different categories of assets. So once we have a good, transparent, open discussion on the implications of the building codes, I think we will have a fairly good decision on the revision of the codes and where we go from there. So I think some of the intersectoral discussion between the private sector and the regulatory bodies, all this in a very open and transparent fashion would really help this deal with this interconnected nature of risks.
And can I just clarify, so the review process that you're mentioning, does it already involve a consultative process with the private sector and others?
It's a highly consultative process. It involves a large number of experts, but sometimes we also need to involve many other stakeholders, and the discussion would be much larger, so that we have a national consensus on the kind of revision that we are aiming at. Thank you.
And because we're going to invite the legislator to answer, I'm going to ask a second clarificatory question, which is that as part of that review process, is Parliament and legislators also involved, or is it strictly executive-led?
Can you just repeat the question?
Is it run by the government, the process, or is Parliament also involved?
At some point, the Parliament would also be involved. It's a question with huge political implications. Once the codes are revised, the cost goes up, everyone would be in the picture. People would be protesting also. Disaster managers would say, yes, these are necessary revisions, but but on the other hand, there would be a lot of protests also. So it's important that you mediate this tension and arrive at a good, satisfactory, consensus-based outcomes.
Thank you very much for that complete response. So moving to you, Rosa, I mean, you'll know better than most, you are extremely fierce in your scrutiny of what comes before you in Parliament in Canada. Parliaments clearly have a role in exerting oversight, scrutiny over plans, exactly such as this review process. They also have to be attentive to civil society views and engagement on this. So they build the public consensus behind which these kind of initiatives must secure support from, in a democracy. So I'd like to invite your thoughts on this question from your parliamentary perspective.
Yes, sure. So, our societies and thus our governments tend to work in silos. They understand the problem in silos and they provide solution in silos. But we are seeing more and more that the interconnection and the causes and the effects and the compounding risk that gets accumulated. And I will describe this using an example. So we have oil sands exploitation. And for every barrel of oil that is produced, you need 30 barrels of water. So at this speed, at this rate of need of water, you are reducing the aquifer level and you are bringing the water level in the rivers very low. So when it comes winter, you don't have any more ice roads because, as I said, Canada is warming fast, but when it comes the summer, you don't have enough water level to hold navigation. So you create that cascade of effects, more. So now our trees in the prairies are getting drier and drier and drier. So when there is these wildfires like what is happening right now, the fire will still remain active in the ground, underground, and they will be reignited in the next spring. So all of this is compounding the risk and making it these wildfires more extinct in surface and higher temperatures. So we really need to have a holistic approach and have solutions that tackle the problem at the cause, at the root, and not just put in Band-Aids. And I want to think that an integrated risk management framework that is mandated by law or policy should be there. And that also that this framework should be adaptive because in Canada, it's a big, huge country, and the situations are different depending on the provinces, but it also needs to respond flexible in time. It has to be flexible in time to be able to add up new information that comes from science. And I think I will stop there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. And on that point, we are getting some answers from the audience to question 4. So let me read out some of them. The first is some good examples, good practice examples come from Brazil. Brazil's central bank has created an innovation space to enable space for innovation and offer sandboxes. But they also need hands-on capacity development, not just from organizations that offer products in that space, i.e. not just from the commercial service providers. There's also the example of the climate change bill going through Parliament, presumably it's a bill in Fiji. Other recommendations to provide data for free instead of charging for it. We know that there's quite a lot of data which is proprietary. And that this requires a very comprehensive risk-informed development, coordination and planning horizontally across line ministries and vertically from national to local levels. Households and communities should also be the focus of governance, as also emphasized by the Sendai Framework target E2. And finally, national level risk management is not merely disasters focused, example in legal immigration, health employment, but are much broader and often therefore in the hands of functional departments or owned by lead political decision makers such as the Prime Minister or the President. So yes, the universe of risk management is extremely large and diverse. So on that note, we are going to take a little breather because I'm now going to focus your minds on the very last question, question 5. And this is, how can trusted sources, assurance bodies, for example, reliable scientific institutes, provide scientific and risk data more effectively to inform and be integrated into public policy, legislation, regulation, assurance, and risk-informed investment obligations by public and private sectors. Where and how is this working? Let me start on the far end, please, from Isabel Joy.
Thank you very much. I think trusted sources in terms of science and risk information is very important, because that is where we get to build the case of why we need to invest in risk reduction initiatives or considerations. As has been mentioned even in the opening session of this session, these aspects the case has been built in other sectors, but in the financial space, it has been lacking, or rather it has been growing gradually. But with this risk information from trusted sources, it will help then to build the case, the economic case more so, on how then do we incorporate aspects relating to risk reduction in investments and budgeting. So indeed, there is a role to play for these trusted sources. And then once they are packaged in a way that they are able to bring out the case for why we need to then invest in risk reduction, then they can be considered in various laws in the budgeting space, financial space, and various aspects. And then, of course, we bring on board our legal drafters on how best to then draft such provisions to then be included in the law, and then they get embedded in what has to be implemented at both, say, national and subnational levels. Thank you. That would be my contribution on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Michael, your response, please, to that same question. You've got some great examples from Kenya.
So, you know,
Trusted sources. Trusted sources.
Academia, of course. That's for sure. No, so there's a practice out there, and the practice I'm aware of is the financial stress testing of the central banks and the supervisory bodies for the greening of the financial system. However, when you look into it, it's early days. I personally would not fully trust it yet, but it's a great start, and the example of Norway means that you can actually put these things in practice. On the other hand, we are really at the cusp of this really interesting data revolution that completely also will transform how we do economic analysis and risk assessment. So we are now piloting what we call agent-based macroeconomic models, where you have basically a representation of not household level, but each firm level. You have information, you have access to it, partly you need to buy it. So the issue that came up on open data is definitely a big issue. And we have examples. One example is actually Canada running a macroeconomic agent-based model, where you can also go geospatial. So here you can run a flood model, a slope stability model, many other natural hazards, overlay this with the locations where the assets are, and then see it on the macroeconomic level, run these complicated scenarios of multiple risks happening, which you were just discussing, so these compounded effects of risks and so forth. So you can, so we are not very far away from kind of a digital twin biophysically, in terms of the biophysical risk characterization, and these new macroeconomic agent-based models that can aggregate the risk up to the macro level, but also scale it down to individual assets, or even do supply chain analysis, which we are currently doing also. So here in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a revolution happening in terms of our capabilities to characterize and then also in a way better regulate the risks. So it's super exciting times, not only to be a scientist pioneering some of these capabilities, but this will massify. Many of us will do this on a daily basis.
Thank you. And Michael, you haven't mentioned the magical words AI. So artificial intelligence is one of the technologies which is also going to revolutionize this space, particularly in terms of interpreting that data. So a couple of thoughts on that.
But I'm here you hit a skeptic because I'm an old statistician. So yes, currently we are using AI mostly for data gathering. The analysis is still done with lots of brains, and we actually know exactly how we characterize the risks and which functions are behind it and so forth. There are capabilities with AI going even larger, and where it's also used now is to solve large stochastic problems that in order to find the solutions. So here the stronger compute and better algorithms will definitely help us to unearth some of the solution pathways.
Okay, thank you very much. A note of skepticism. And still room for human intelligence. So on the point of human intelligence, Amelia, I'm going to ask you to please help us close off this session. I'm particularly struck by what Michael had said about the trusted sources, yes, but we also, so you, from a standard setter perspective, from a reporter, you're setting the requirements for reporting. People are reporting to you. How trustworthy is what they are reporting to you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the disclosures are actually going to a public register. It's called the Climate-Related Disclosures Register. It is regulated by a separate entity. It's regulated by our Financial Markets Authority. And it is regulated. There is definitely some law around making sure that what you're saying is factual, is accurate. But there is only assurance, separate independent assurance over the greenhouse gas related disclosures. It is very challenging to assure non-financial information. So yeah, that's definitely something that we're finding. But I mean, I think in terms of this overarching question about how does science and risk information inform decision making, I think it's worth thinking of that really traditional carrot and stick model, because you've got to have the carrot and stick model, I think, to both produce the data and then use it for the decision making, because it's really only going to effectively inform and be integrated into decision making if there is some form of incentive to do so. And by that, I agree with you, Michael, it's not just a regulatory or legal incentive, it can also be a reputational benefit or some form of enhanced decision making, but there has to be a desire to do that. But at the same time, you are going to need some form of regulatory mechanism to force the collection and force the transparency of that information. But an issue we are finding in terms of the use of information in this space is that data collection systems are not built with these end users in mind. They are, climate data sets are often highly inaccessible to non-academic users. And I mean, the scale of some of these data sets is so large that even our biggest corporate entities in New Zealand do not have the computing power to run them. So we're definitely finding there is a mismatch between the desire for information on resilience, on climate, and also an understanding of the inherent uncertainty inside this information. People think that it is going to give them much more accurate and certain information than it actually does. So we're really trying to bridge those gaps in New Zealand. We have encouraged, as I said, the sectors to get together to do sector-related scenario analysis. And I've heard a lot over the last couple of days about diversity of thought and inclusivity, and that has been fundamental, bringing together diverse perspectives to identify assumptions, to identify drivers of risk and resilience. And a key factor, I think, that has been successful there is it's a communal learning process. We have a group of people understanding a new topic together. They're not, having to be as uncomfortable and challenged as if they were doing it by themselves. So I would definitely encourage, I was really interested in the work in India about what's happening in terms of that collective nature of understanding science and risk information better.
Thank you very much. We haven't used this word often enough, but it's come out in much of what you said, which is we need a really open and collaborative ecosystem to make this work. Yeah. So pluralism, there's no silver bullet. You can't just rely on the data which is currently being produced. You also have to have the intellectual ability to pass it, communicate it to the public, etc. So thank you very much for your responses to that final question. We do have more which are coming, but they're going to come from the audience. And I'd now like to reflect back some of the answers that we've got from the audience to this final question. So, and it's really focused around the role and the reliability of science and information coming through the scientific process and academia. By having science integrated into financial regulations, so thumbs up for that. An example is to consider not only earthquake risk, to consider also earthquake risk and presumably other forms of risk.
طبعا هناك الكثير من المخاطر ولكن لابد أن نقوم بزيادة الاستثمار بالحد من الكوارث بحيث هناك ترابط ما بين الهدف والأهداف العريضة. لابد أن نحتاج إلى البيانات والمعلومات والأهم من ذلك
misinformation, because of course we haven't talked about disinformation and misinformation, how reliable data sets are, etc. Scientific institutions should also actively participate in disaster risk management. The scientific information should be understandable and accessible for people. It should be easy to understand. So with key messages, so that hold communications, public engagement challenge. Great, okay, so now we have a top-line question from the online audience. This is a great thing about Slido. It's a popularity contest. It's like the Eurovision of these kind of global platforms. So the key question here that I would like to pose to the audience is, how can the DRR NGO community improve its advocacy with government policymakers, and what can be learned from the relative failure in climate change advocacy? Great, you've set the cat among the pigeons here. So, shall I repeat that question? How can the DRR NGO community improve its advocacy with government policymakers, and what can be learned from the relative failure in climate change advocacy? So your response to that question. Let us start with Isabel Joy, please.
Thank you. My response to that would be basically doing it in a collaborative manner, allowing the NGO to collaborate with various stakeholders in how they do their advocacy. Let them do it in an inclusive manner, have adequate stakeholder consultations, and definitely include the government, relevant government departments, if at all they would want the matter which they are advocating for to be included in law. So it's basically not doing their advocacy in silos, but basically bringing everyone on board, and especially those that are concerned with developing the necessary laws to also be included, so that whatever they are advocating for can also be included in law if it's agreeable. That would be my response to that. Thank you.
Just to understand the question better, it involves a contrast with the climate change
yes, I mean,
advocacy?
the question, yeah, you can interpret it the way that you wish, but the question has a particular view which is offered. How can the DRR NGO community improve its advocacy with government policymakers, and what can be learnt from the relative failure in climate change advocacy?
So, very good question. Climate change advocacy has relatively been, I mean, I'm a little bit putting my neck out, disconnected with the community. It has been a very abstract, lot of abstract formulations. It has also been a very contested process. Whereas the DRR, NGO community, more grounded, more solution-oriented, and more connected with the community, more connected with the well-being of the immediate well-being of the people. It starts with solidarity with the community right in the context of a crisis. So, there is a different kind of empathy here, and I think that empathy needs to be sustained. So I would say that you remain connected, more deeply connected with the community, you present the issues better, you have better better data from the field, and you understand the policy and the fiscal context much better. I think the NGOs, disaster NGOs, would have a much, much better chance of success, and there are so many things to learn from the relative failure of the climate change NGOs.
Okay, that's great. So now we can take some questions from the in-house audience here. We do have a roving mic. So just wait until I saw three hands go up. I saw the lady and the second, okay, the lady in the front. Please do introduce yourself very briefly.
Okay, thank you so much. And my question is referred to, in general, the regulation should leverage business growth and create opportunities for collective development between the regulator and the private sector, okay? In Colombia, we have mechanisms such as workforce taxes, which allowed for direct allocation of contributions to projects that generate social, okay? How can we motivate regulatory frameworks to allow for more direct investment from the private sector like this?
So can I just paraphrase that? How can regulatory framework incentivize investment from or to the private sector?
To the private sector.
Yeah, okay.
To permit the private sector in development other projects directly.
Okay, incentivize private sector investment directly. Thank you very much. So that's question one. We're going to take the three questions very quickly because otherwise we'll run out of time. The lady in the second row, please.
Hi, I'm Lilia Cunningham from Kaiser University, and this is more of a comment than a question. So I live in Florida, where we have 5 hurricanes in the last 3 years. There is rapid implementation of rules and regulations. So within a year, we had new building codes. The problem is that the builders pass this on to the community. Somebody has to pay for the bill, and often it doesn't come from taxes, it comes from our pockets. So we saw people having to leave the cities. Housing became extraordinarily expensive. For a 3-bedroom, $300,000. For people that are elderly that live in condominiums, now all of a sudden they had to pay $20,000, $25,000, which they did not have, to make improvements in the buildings for safety, obviously. The builders now have to build the homes higher because of floods. So my question is, where are we going to get the money to implement?
Okay, thank you very much. And that touches on something precisely that Dr. Vatsaf said, which is they're drawing up new building codes. Is the construction sector in India going to pass on the cost to the public? Yeah, so we'll come back to you for that. And the gentleman in the middle, please, your question.
Thank you so much, Madam Facilitator. My name is Pius, I'm from SADC. I think most of the session you treated us like online participants. I think we needed to verbalize our questions so that I see that we have only 10 minutes to go before we finish. But my question is this. Is there a country with a DRR financing legislation? If it is there, for example, I hear Kenya saying that they have a public-private partnership legislation that is binding. I struggle to find a point. How do you incentivize the private sector to put money in that? And because, I mean, a private sector, they are for profit, and you can't bind them by legislation if they don't have incentives to contribute. How are you doing that? And what I know is that in terms of the countries in the budgets that are allocated to different, in member states, they are normally in sectors. Defense sector, energy sector, agriculture, and so on. And how is this then, how do you tease out to say, okay, the budget for Department of Agriculture, for defense, so much budget is for DRR. How do you do that? Because I think we are superfluous in terms of, we are theorizing. I wanted to find something concrete so we can learn from that and implement when we go back home.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to, thank you all for your 3 questions. The good news is that you will hear all of your responses. The bad news is that our respondents have only 1 minute because we have to vacate this room by 5:24. So 1 minute, please. I'd like to start with Isabel Joy, of course, on the issue of disaster risk financing legislation.
Thank you very much for those questions. In terms of, I think there are 2 questions. There's one whether there's a country that has a DRR financing strategy. I can speak for Kenya. Basically, what we are working towards is developing a disaster risk management strategy and then updating what we had as a disaster risk financing strategy to have now broader aspects on innovative financing for disaster risk reduction. So basically, it's a work in progress for us in Kenya. And in terms of how we are encouraging the private sector to invest in aspects relating to DRR, yes, I did mention the law on public-private partnership, because that is the starting point. The Public-Private Partnership Act is what then provides that enabling framework on how the private sector can collaborate with the government in aspects of investments and any other aspects. And then going a step further, I mentioned that there is ongoing work to then include the climate risks considerations as well as disaster risk reduction considerations. And when the private sector do opt to collaborate with the government, going forward, the investments that they collaborate with the government in will then include DRR considerations as well as climate risks considerations. So that is, it's a gradual step. It's not just a one-off aspect. It has been a gradual step for us. So the first step is having a PPP arrangement, which is a plus. Then the next step is to improve that PPP arrangement to then include climate-related risks consideration as well as DRR considerations. And we believe when we then capacity build the private sector and various stakeholders on how then we can collaborate, then going forward we will then be able to incentivize them and they will get to see the need of why investing in PPP arrangements that include climate risks considerations as well as DRR considerations are indeed savings over the long run going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to say also something about the budget tracking aspects of the question?
Yes. In terms of how to then identify what is going towards disaster risk reduction, there are various ways of doing that, say through climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, budget tagging. Currently, there's ongoing work with the UNDRR support to the government of Kenya and other countries, where there's the support towards tagging climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction across government programs. So it's been done in a pilot phase so far, and then that will enable us to see as a country what exactly are we investing in DRR as a country. Then, once we get that investment gap, then we will get to know how much then do we need to put forth in terms of disaster risk reduction considerations as well as climate change adaptation. So one thing we all need to understand is these things take time and they are normally stepwise. You cannot have the amount you need to invest in DRR if you haven't done the tagging yet. So the first step, identify your budget programs within the budget books. Segregate what constitutes disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Then next step is how much goes towards that. Next step, what is the gap? Then going forward, try and have programs that then promote disaster risk reduction based on the financing gap that has been identified through that process. So I would look at it as a step-by-step process.
Thank you very much. So we have to be, I just wanted to make sure you were able to cover that because Kenya is a very good example with that particular pilot on tracking and budget tracking and tagging. But we only have literally a few seconds for this section, so not everybody's going to be able to answer, but I'm going to ask Krishna, please, there was that specific question directed towards you. Your succinct answer, please.
So again, referring to my own country's example, I would say that there are very distinct provisions for DRR financing. It relates to both the levels, national level and state levels. It relates to both the functions, response, recovery, and preparedness, as well as mitigation at both the levels. So the clear legislative provisions for the financial allocations do help us secure the resources. Then we have a constitutional body which allocates the resources for 5 years. So it is a predetermined, pre-arranged allocation. So even the 5th year from now, the states know how much they would get for response and mitigation. So these are the allocations. They are independent of the budgetary process, and all the states would get these resources as a matter of right. So I think this is a good practice, and we can consider that. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for both of those responses. I hope that they have, you're satisfied with some of the responses that you've got, but of course there's the opportunity to speak directly after this session. We are now done with the Q&A and we are moving into the final session, which is where the panelists get to share their final conclusions. So just as a reminder, what were we looking for? So we wanted this session to provide a path forward by identifying and recommending key frameworks, innovations and practices to enable shared accountability and improve DRR governance through a variety of legal and regulatory frameworks. So you've mentioned a number of them. This is your final opportunity to think of others that we may wish to add to our next steps agenda. Amelia, why don't we start with you, please?
I just finished by saying every single one of your jurisdictions has a national standard setter. Please go and talk to them. Tell them what you know about resilience, about disaster risk, recovery, preparedness. They will be interested in it as they are thinking about sustainability reporting, climate-related disclosures, nature-related disclosures. I think it's a really fantastic opportunity to use this concept of resilience to bring these two communities together.
Thank you. Michael.
It's amazing what we can do already, but how little we are doing actually in terms of really making smarter decisions. What's for me quite important, what's going to be ahead of us also in terms of regulation, is that because of the data richness and our analytical capabilities, we can do much more precise policy instruments. So one example to the question of participation of the private sector, there is the systemic risk tax that was invented, for example, where you can actually regulate on the individual bank and even on the individual transaction. And just translate this into a DRR context, you see what kind of capabilities there are, and the type of crude regulatory things we are doing today will not exist in 10 years from now.
Okay, moving into another age. Rosa, your final thoughts, please.
Yes. listen, I realize that there is no enough communication between the DRI community and the legislators, and we need each other. And I think that what we need to do is to embrace integrated governance approaches, because we need to integrate a whole government and a whole society approach. We have to promote adaptive and flexible policies. The governments move very slowly. I come from science and engineering, and my world was much faster. Now in politics, it moves a very slow pace, but it moves depending on the information that we receive. So we need to promote that. And for that, we have to engage multi-stakeholder, for sure, but in Canada, for example, we also have to include the right holders, the indigenous people. And only then we'll be able to really progress and inclusive and with efficiency, because up to now we just work in silos, and these silos needs to open, and we need to have cross-sectoral and multidisciplinary ways to progress, because the clock is ticking with respect to the multi-crisis that the planet is living: biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, climate, global warming, etc. So thank you so much. This was very interesting session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rosa. Now, our final two panelists, please. I'm sorry, but you'll get about 30 seconds each. Your final reflections on today's discussion.
The same as the senator said, the policy and the programmatic changes and the legislative changes, financial provisions, all of them take a lot of time. And you need to be patient with the process. You need to work hard at it. We have worked hard at it, so it takes a lot of effort. But one thing that is equally important, whatever we are doing, that needs to be directed at bringing benefits to the community, affected community. It should not be an abstract kind of a pursuit. No, you go on conducting risk assessment one after another. It takes you nowhere. Only when you start working in the context of community, how you are providing them support for reconstruction, for mitigation, would you be successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Isabel Joy, please, 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. My closing remarks would be risk-informed legislation remains key. Laws take time to develop, but we need to ensure that we bring on board all the key players when developing the requisite laws. And going forward, then we'll ensure that we have resilient economies as well as resilient globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in the last few seconds, I just want to add my voice, and that is, we are very delighted that we've actually brought two fields together, because we are in a field building moment where we have the existing DRR community, which is learning very rapidly and innovating very rapidly, but it could do with joining hands with the innovation which we are seeing in the financial markets regulation community, where equally they are perhaps outstripping us because of the greater attention of politicians to what happens in the financial markets as opposed to what happens through natural or through the disasters. So it's a space to watch, it's a space to engage with. We also have solutions that have not actually been implemented as yet. It's worth noting that we had an online participant who commented in response to the last question. Well, we have the solutions there. We have a mechanism which was developed and launched but has not been supported or resourced, and that was the Global Risk Assessment Framework, the GRAF, which many of you will be familiar with. And it was formally launched at the Global Platform in 2019. So a number of the solutions are there. Communities need to connect with one another. This has been really a bridge-building session today, so thank you very much to all of our participants, our panelists who are here on the stage, to those of you who participated in the room, and to those of you who participated online, and to the fabulous team at the Secretariat who pulled this together with advisors. Thank you.